April 1945. The war's last cold rain fell on a dirt road outside Frankfurt. Mud splashed around a group of exhausted women in gray uniforms, their hands trembling as they raised them toward the horizon where American trucks rumbled closer. Canvas flapped in the wind, boots crunched against wet gravel, and the sound of a distant engine echoed like thunder fading after years of chaos. These were members of the German Nachrichtenfelfen female communications, auxiliaries trained to handle radios and records, now stripped of both rank and purpose. The first U.S. soldier who approached didn't shout. He simply gestured with his rifle and said, "Line up." His voice was steady, not cruel. The women obeyed, their eyes darting toward the fields, still half expecting the sound of artillery. When none came, only the drip of rain on helmets. The silence felt heavier than any bombardment. Inside the pocket of one woman's tunic was a folded photograph, a small, fading picture of her baby, taken in 1943, before her deployment. The edges were soft from being held every night through bomb raids and retreats. She pressed it against her chest, heartbeat quickening. The Americans would surely confiscate it. They took everything. That's what their officers had told them. The Allies will erase your identity. When the group reached the roadside checkpoint, their bags were dumped onto a tarp. Watches, combs, letters, everything catalogued, everything logged. One soldier looked away when a woman began to cry over a confiscated wedding ring. Another officer, younger, simply muttered, "Rules are rules." The women believed him, but something small began to stir, not defiance, but disbelief. The Americans weren't shouting. No one struck them. No one even called them names. The war had taught them to expect hatred. What they got instead was indifference, and somehow, that was more confusing. The woman with the photo felt the paper cling to her skin under the damp fabric. Her pulse hammered. If they found it, it would be gone, the only piece of her old life. A soldier motioned for her to empty her pockets. She hesitated, then obeyed, her hand trembling as she reached inside. The photo slipped between her fingers, landing face up in a puddle. A baby's smile stared back at both prisoner and guard. The guard crouched down slowly, eyes narrowing. What he did next would challenge everything she thought she knew about the enemy. The rain eased by the time they reached the camp intake station. A long wooden hut with corrugated walls that smelled of wet canvas and diesel. Inside, the air was tense, thick with the rustle of papers and the metallic clatter of typewriters. The women stood in line, their boots squeaking on the soaked floorboards, as American guards checked their belongings one by one. On a metal table lay a growing pile of confiscated items, pocket knives, notebooks, ribbons, lockets, even soap. Every item was tagged, logged, and carried to the storeroom. It was procedure, mechanical, efficient, and impersonal. To the prisoners, it felt like a slow erasure of identity. One woman whispered, "This is how it ends our names, our faces, our memories." The officer standing nearby didn't react. He simply tapped his clipboard and said, "Next." The woman who'd dropped the photo in the puddle earlier now faced that same table again. The paper was damp but intact. She held it tight behind her back. The guard in front of her, young fair-haired, eyes red from exhaustion, noticed. His hand extended, waiting. She froze, unsure whether to hand it over or risk punishment. Reports from that era confirmed such moments were common. Allied intake policies demanded full searches. Even personal letters were often seized. Between March and June 1945, more than 400,000 German POWs passed through American custody. And for most, this was the first direct contact with the enemy. Fear was currency. Silence was armor that the guard's expression softened for a fraction of a second. The flicker of confusion crossed her face. He looked at the photograph, then at her. No words were exchanged. He placed it carefully back into her hand and said only, "Keep it dry." She didn't move. She didn't understand. Behind her, Another officer barked an order. The routine continued, boots marching, pens scratching, names recorded. But for one woman, the ground had shifted. This wasn't mercy as propaganda had described it. This was something smaller, stranger, more human. That night, as she lay on a straw mattress inside the barracks, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of wood and gust of wind carried the same question through her mind. Why would an enemy care about my child? The answer would begin to unfold at dawn, when rumors started spreading through the camp. Morning light crept through the slats of the wooden barracks, tracing thin silver lines across damp blankets. The air smelled of burnt coffee and wet uniforms. Outside, boots thudded rhythmically as American guards switched shifts. Inside, whispers moved faster than the wind. He gave it back to her. One woman said, "He didn't take the photo." Others listened, half believing, half dismissing it as impossible. At roll call, the same U.S. officer from the intake hut stood near the gate, clipboard in hand. His name tag read L.T. J. Callahan. He looked younger in daylight, barely older than the women he was guarding. When the woman with the baby photo stepped forward, he nodded slightly, not as an officer to a prisoner, but as one human to another. It was brief, but in a camp where every gesture mattered. It felt seismic. Officially, POW regulations were rigid, all personal materials subject to inspection, anything deemed propaganda to be confiscated. But as the lieutenant wrote later in his log, photographs of family should remain with owner's morale factor. No threat. That single line would never appear in any report, but it changed the camp's tone overnight. By late morning, a Red Cross representative arrived for an inspection. The officer greeted her formally, papers in order. The woman prisoner watched from a distance as their conversation lingered near her barracks. The Red Cross worker smiled. She noticed the photos some women now carried discreetly in their pockets. No reprimand followed, no punishment, just the quiet sound of pencils checking boxes on a clipboard. The woman held her photograph that night under a thin blanket, tracing the baby's smile with her thumb. She remembered Berlin's ruins, her husband missing since 1944, the months of retreat, and how this scrap of paper was all she had left of another world. Now, an American officer, an enemy, had given it back. That act felt heavier than any weapon she'd faced. In the dim light, she folded the image and slipped it inside her tunic once more. Around her, others began whispering plans to recover their own keepsakes, a ribbon, a small prayer card, a lock of hair. Something new was spreading through the camp, quiet but unstoppable, curiosity replacing fear, and with dawn approaching, the whispers would reach every corner of the barracks. By the next sunrise, the rumor had grown legs. Inside the women's barracks, the air buzzed with low murmurs and cautious laughter that hadn't been heard in months. Tin mugs clinked against ration bowls as women leaned close to share fragments of the story. He didn't take it. He said she could keep it. Maybe they're changing the rules. For the first time, the camp sounded almost alive. The bunks creaked with every whisper. Rainwater dripped from the ceiling, forming small puddles beneath their boots. Some prisoners were still afraid to believe it. One woman said flatly, "They'll search us again." But another smiled and whispered, "If they wanted to, they already would have." In that moment, the smallest shred of hope cut through the heavy air like sunlight sneaking through barbed wire. U.S. guards walking past could sense it too, the subtle shift in mood. The way eyes no longer dropped instantly to the floor. They weren't fools. They'd seen POW despair before, but this felt different, quiet, controlled, even dignified. Some guards pretended not to notice the small paper edges peeking from pockets. Maybe orders hadn't changed, but something deeper had. Perception. Historically, women made up less than 2% of all German POWs in American custody, and their camps often doubled as administrative holding centers. No forced labor, but strict discipline. Yet, inside these walls, discipline was being quietly rewritten by empathy. That evening, as dusk settled, one of the women pulled out a hidden photograph of her parents. Another produced a child's drawing folded in half. A third woman hummed a lullaby soft, almost inaudible. The sound rippled through the barracks like a secret memory. Then, without warning, headlights flared through the cracks in the wood. A truck engine idled outside the gate. The murmur stopped. Guards stepped out into the mud as the Red Cross emblem came into view on the side of the vehicle. The women pressed their faces to the gaps between boards, whispering guesses, supplies, medicine, punishment. The engines died, doors opened, and a single voice shouted, "Parcels from Geneva." Inside, someone dropped her tin mug. The clang echoed through the entire building. The sound of boots splashing through mud broke the morning silence. Outside the wire fence, 3 white trucks stood like ghosts in the mist, the red crosses on their sides shining faintly through the drizzle. The gate swung open with a metallic groan. Every woman in the barracks leaned forward, gripping the edges of bunks, eyes wide. The guards themselves seemed calmer, almost casual, as if this delivery was routine. But for the prisoners, it felt like the unthinkable. The boxes were stacked shoulder high, marked Geneva, humanitarian supplies. U.S. medics and Red Cross workers unloaded them with practiced efficiency, one crate after another, each marked with neat handwriting. Soap, coffee, sugar, cigarettes, writing paper. The smell of roasted beans cut through the damp air like a scent from another world. One woman whispered, "It smells like my mother's kitchen." Each camp was supposed to receive its share. Reports suggest nearly 24,000 Red Cross parcels crossed Europe every week in spring 1945. For many people, they were the first real taste of normal life after years of deprivation. Inside the boxes lay the simple luxuries the war had stripped away: butter, biscuits, tea, canned milk, even chocolate. The women passed them between bunks, touching the wrappers as if they were relics. The same lieutenant from before, Callahan, supervised quietly from the gate. He didn't speak much, but his presence carried weight. The prisoners noticed he wasn't just guarding, he was watching reactions. For him, this wasn't about mercy. It was about proof that humanity could still function inside fences. As the parcels were distributed, a new rhythm emerged: laughter, the tearing of cardboard, even a cough that sounded almost like a chuckle. One woman clutched a bar of soap to her chest and said softly, "I'll smell like a person again." Others nodded, half smiling through tears, and then, buried at the bottom of one crate, they found a roll of film and a note in English, for identification photography. The officer glanced at it, then looked toward the women. Cameras meant pictures, and pictures meant memories. By dusk, tripods were already being set up near the medical hut. The women exchanged puzzled looks, wondering what the Americans would do this time: take something away, or give something back again. The next morning, the camp stirred earlier than usual. Word had spread that the Americans were setting up a camera near the infirmary, the same area where new arrivals were registered. The prisoners stood uncertain, coats buttoned, faces washed with the thin soap from yesterday's parcels. Frost lingered on the grass. Somewhere beyond the fence, a generator coughed to life, powering the U.S. Army's portable field camera. One by one, the women were called forward. The photographer, a stocky sergeant with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, adjusted the tripod and shouted, "Hold still." The click of the shutter echoed like gunfire, but no one flinched. Each flash captured not soldiers or enemies, but exhausted women, faces hollowed by hunger and disbelief. Their photographs would be used for records. But what the lens preserved went deeper than documentation. For decades afterward, historians would debate the emotional power of these images. Between March and August 1945, hundreds of such portraits were taken in U.S. camps across occupied Germany. None were meant for propaganda, Yet they told a quiet truth. Defeat had faces, not numbers. The woman with the baby photo waited at the end of the line. When her turn came, she hesitated before sitting on the small wooden stool. The sergeant looked up from his viewfinder and said softly, "You can smile if you want." She didn't, but her eyes lifted, and for a heartbeat, the cold barracks disappeared. The flash went off, a split second of light, freezing everything she still carried inside her. Later, as prints were hung too dry, the women gathered around, pointing and whispering. Some laughed shyly at their own images. Others turned away, unsettled by the sight of themselves outside fear. For the first time in years, they saw not propaganda, not uniformed ghosts, but human beings, with names, features, and traces of life left in their eyes. That night, back in the barracks, the woman unfolded her baby's picture and placed it beside the fresh one the Americans had taken. Two worlds stared back, the one she lost, and the one that, somehow, still recognized her, outside. The officer who'd allowed that first photo stood by the fence, watching lanterns flicker inside the huts. In his logbook, he wrote one quiet note before closing it. Recognition changes everything. That evening, the camp felt oddly still. No shouting, no metallic echoes, just the hum of the generator fading into dusk. Inside the administrative hut, Lieutenant Callahan sat hunched over his logbook. The faint glow of a desk lamp, carving shadows across his uniform. The day's report was supposed to be routine, identification photographs completed, supplies distributed, but he hesitated before finishing the line. His pencil hovered over the page. Then he wrote something he wasn't meant to. Personal photos returned to owners, no disciplinary issue observed. Technically, that single sentence broke protocol. The manual was clear. POWs could not retain non-essential personal property. Yet, every instinct told him this was necessary. He'd seen what it did, the way those photos changed the atmosphere, the sudden quiet order that no threat could ever achieve. To Callahan, compassion wasn't weakness. It was strategy. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes, thinking of the reports he'd read before deployment, that German camps rarely allowed similar gestures. The difference, he realized, wasn't power. It was perspective. "We win more by decency than by force," he murmured, the words barely audible over the ticking wall clock. Outside, the women gathered near the barracks window where the last light spilled in from the yard. Someone had managed to clean her child's photo and pin it neatly inside her bunk. Another prisoner was quietly sketching the outline of the camp fence, trying to remember the shape of home beyond it. Records from post-war interviews suggest that such moments weren't isolated. Many Allied officers interpreted the Geneva Convention not just as legal duty, but as moral restoration. Each act of small kindness, a photo returned, a letter forwarded, became a silent rebellion against the war's corrosion. Callahan closed his logbook and stepped outside, the cool night air biting against his face. Across the yard, he saw the faint silhouettes of the women moving inside their dimly lit hut. Their voices rose softly, not in song, but in conversation, something normal, almost peaceful. For a second, the lieutenant wondered how long that peace would last. His hand brushed against a small notebook in his coat pocket, a note to himself. Next, inspection soon. Must justify leniency. The question wasn't if he'd get caught, but what he'd say when they asked why. 3 weeks later, the calm rhythm of camp life was broken by the unmistakable roar of engines. 2 jeeps and a staff car rolled through the front gate, splattering mud as military brass stepped out, their polished boots and crisp uniforms slicing through the damp morning air. The women froze, mid-task, some holding broom handles, others carrying water buckets. The guard snapped to attention. Inspections always meant one thing: fear. Lieutenant Callahan straightened his cap and walked toward the approaching officers. At the front was Colonel Myers, clipboard under his arm, eyes cold and sharp. His tone was flat. Unannounced inspection. We'll review your prisoner protocols. The lieutenant nodded, throat tightening. He'd been expecting this. Inside the barracks, the women scrambled to hide anything personal. A ribbon, a letter, a photograph. The woman with the baby photo slipped hers into the lining of a Red Cross food parcel. If found, it could be labeled contraband. She mouthed a silent prayer as footsteps drew near. The inspectors moved systematically, counting bunks, checking ration logs, testing water pumps. One paused near a bunk, eyes catching the edge of a folded paper. The woman's pulse thundered in her ears. But the officer only adjusted the blanket and moved on. Callahan's jaw unclenched. Historically, around 1 in 10 U.S.-run POW camps failed early inspections for sanitation or emotional neglect issues. This one, however, appeared immaculate. Beds lined perfectly, hygiene remarkable, morale visibly higher than average. The colonel scribbled notes, clearly puzzled. "You're maintaining order well, Lieutenant. Prisoners seem cooperative." Callahan's answer was careful. "Yes, sir. We've focused on discipline through predictability. Nothing unpredictable happens here." The colonel nodded, satisfied, and moved outside to continue. Behind him, one woman exhaled for the first time in minutes, as the convoy prepared to leave. The colonel paused near the yard. He noticed something strange, faint laughter drifting from one of the huts. Not hysteria, not mockery, just laughter. "They're laughing," he muttered. Callahan didn't answer. When the vehicles pulled away, dust rose in their wake, and the camp fell silent again. The women looked at each other, astonished they'd survived the scrutiny. Then, quietly, someone began to hum. It wasn't defiance, it was relief. The next morning, that same colonel would file his report to headquarters, one line that no one expected. When the inspection report reached headquarters, it didn't read like a checklist, it read like a question. "Camp morale, unusually high," Colonel Myers had written. "Prisoners display emotional stability uncommon for wartime captivity." No mention of contraband, no reprimand, no suspicion, just quiet astonishment. What none of the brass realized was that the camp's secret wasn't tighter. Discipline, it was empathy, disguised as order. Back inside the barbed perimeter, word of the inspection's outcome spread faster than rumor. The women exhaled together that evening, the tension draining from the air. They weren't just relieved, they were bewildered. Somehow, they had passed, even with hidden photographs, even with forbidden memories tucked into their pockets, in the mess hall. The sound of spoons against metal plates blended with a low hum of conversation. For weeks, the camp had lived under silence. Now it sounded almost normal. A few women began trading portions of bread and coffee, acts of quiet generosity that mirrored what they'd seen from their captors. Compassion was contagious. From his office window, Lieutenant Callahan observed quietly, coffee steaming in his hand. To him, these weren't victories, they were corrections. Every rule bent toward decency was a small act of defiance against the brutality that had defined Europe for 6 years. His logbook now contained notes beyond statistics. Routine restored. Prisoners cooperative. Emotional stability remarkable. Later, during an official debrief, a senior officer asked him bluntly, "What's your method?" Callahan's reply was almost clinical. "We let them remember home." Historical records from the U.S. 12th Army Group confirmed similar findings. Camps with access to Red Cross correspondence, family photos, and structured routine showed drastically fewer discipline problems. Psychologists later described it as memory therapy under captivity. The human mind, even in defeat, clings to dignity when allowed to remember love. That night, a storm rolled across the horizon. Lightning flashed above the wire, briefly illuminating faces turned toward the sky. The woman with the baby photo pressed it to her chest again, whispering something only she could hear. For the first time since her capture, She didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like someone surviving the end of the world and understanding, finally, why the enemy behaved like no enemy she'd ever been taught to fear. By morning, that understanding would travel beyond the camp, carried upward in the colonel's next report. 2 weeks later, a memo arrived sealed in brown paper, stamped with the insignia of the U.S. 12th Army Group. Lieutenant Callahan sliced it open at his desk. The words were brief, bureaucratic, almost indifferent. Effective immediately. Personal photographs permitted, if not, maintain proper documentation. He read the line twice, then leaned back, half smiling. What had begun as a quiet rebellion had now become official policy. That afternoon, the news rippled through the camp like spring wind. The women gathered in small clusters, disbelief painted on their faces. One by one, they pulled out creased photos, prayer cards, tiny keepsakes hidden for months. There were tears, but not the hopeless kind. They laughed through them, showing each other faces of husbands, children, and parents, faces they thought they'd never see again without fear. "See," one whispered, holding up a picture of a toddler with a wooden toy. "He's 3 now." Another nodded, pressing her photo close to her heart. Even the guards stopped pretending not to notice. For once, they didn't issue warnings. They smiled and walked past. According to camp records from July 1945, the new directive covered over 90,000 prisoners across multiple facilities in occupied Germany. Inspectors noted a measurable decline in disciplinary incidents, though the reports didn't mention why morale improved so drastically. Numbers told part of the story. The rest lived in moments too human for paperwork. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the tree line, Callahan stood near the barbed wire, watching the women pin their photographs above bunks. A light breeze carried the faint scent of burning wood and coffee. One prisoner, noticing him, gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged gratitude without breaking the fragile balance between captor and captive. He turned back toward his office, writing a final note in the day's log. They keep order because they keep memory. It wasn't a report. It was a realization later that night. The woman from Frankfurt lay awake staring at her baby's smile in the dim glow of a lantern. She thought of the man who had returned it, of the rules rewritten by empathy. The war might still be ending beyond the wire, but inside, something deeper had already shifted. And when she finally closed her eyes, she imagined what that child might look like now, free. Berlin, 1947, 2 years after surrender. The city still smelled of dust and brick powder, the sound of hammers echoing across broken streets. In a small apartment rebuilt from rubble, a woman hung a single-framed photo on a cracked wall, her child, smiling, frozen in a world untouched by war. Beneath it, folded inside a tin box, lay another image, her own POW photograph, taken in that American camp months after capture. 2 lives, side by side, one before, one after, both surviving. She was no longer a prisoner, but the habits of captivity lingered. Every morning, she checked the window as if waiting for roll call. Every night, she whispered to her child the story that still felt impossible. How an American officer, an enemy, had handed her back this picture instead of taking it away. "They saw me," she said softly, "not just the uniform." Across Europe, hundreds of former POS carried similar memories home. Reports indicate that by 1948, more than 370,000 German prisoners had been repatriated from U.S. custody, most describing the experience not as mercy, but as confusion turned to reflection. Historians later called it the moral dissonance of defeat. The idea that kindness could exist inside barbed wire, unsettled every narrative they'd been taught. The woman kept the photograph clean, even when food was scarce. She polished the frame with a scrap of linen and set it near the window so the light would touch it each morning. To her, that light wasn't just sunlight. It was proof that memory could outlast humiliation. Sometimes, when the wind rattled the loose glass panes, she'd recall the smell of wet wood, the distant hum of generators, the faint voice that said, "Keep it dry." It wasn't forgiveness she felt. It was recognition that even in the wreckage, something human had refused to die. One evening, her daughter, now old enough to ask questions, pointed at the photo. "Who gave it back to you?" the girl asked. The woman smiled faintly, eyes far away. "Someone who was supposed to hate me," she replied. Outside, Berlin's streetlights flickered back to life. Inside, the picture glowed in their reflection, a small rebellion against forgetting.